communicating, recording, and something should be. It's very slow today.
It's all right. We're all a little slow at 6 p.m. It's okay.
You're certainly recording, okay? We just don't have a PowerPoint.
There we go.
What's it doing now?
Maybe down there.
No, it doesn't want to do anything at the moment, no. I like our system. Let's go and pause our recording. PowerPoint. Good.
Thank you. That's all right. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight. Okay, DJ. On this topic, and many thanks to my students and other guests who have traveled here tonight to hear my presentation. I wish to offer a special expression of thanks to members of the humanities faculty here at the university for their warm welcome and for their inclusion into their scholarly community and into the teaching and learning culture at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David. A special also thank you to Betsy, who's come here on her 21st birthday to hear this lecture. I'm going to make it worth your while. I think you can tell. My talk tonight is based on my most current writing project, which focuses on a 7th century collection of Byzantine medical miracles titled The Miracles of Saint Artemios. In general terms, my particular research addresses the intersection of religion and healthcare practices, as well as attitudes about and approaches towards the ill body in monastic and hagiographic texts. I was drawn to the topic of medical miracles through my study of social ethics in monastic texts, which began with some very uninspired approaches to how economics impacted Christian communities in late antiquity, specifically as they related to lending and debt. This research led me from questions about how usurious practices impacted a religious population or a single person's life to consider other aspects of the intersection of religion and social welfare, such as how views of authority, ascetic activity, systems of healthcare, views of dying, death, and dead bodies in the sources might assist historians in rethinking the social history and theological anthropology of 6th and 7th century Palestinian and Egyptian monastic life and lay persons. These are important themes and timely within my disciplinary fields of patristics and Byzantine studies, and they reflect my pleasure in and my appreciation for the approach of late antique, early Byzantine authors towards both religious realities and simple challenges of ordinary life. These are challenges that remain, I believe, not terribly far removed from our own daily concerns. And I am not a historian of antiquity disinterested in daily concerns. I was born and raised in the state of Washington in the Pacific Northwest corner of the United States. I have a fundamentally pragmatic approach to life that I come by honestly, having inherited it from two people shaped by pioneer heritage, set in motion when my Welsh ancestors sailed in 1722 from Bristol to work on the tobacco plantations of Virginia. Consequently, this pragmatism deeply shapes my scholarship and my teaching, to which my brand new students can attest, perhaps some to their dismay and others to their joy. I don't know, I'll let you decide. Further, as a scholar committed to recovering marginalized voices, I am interested in answering the following questions. How does being sick or being perceived as being sick shape or impact an individual's role within a religious community? As well, when illness is an identity marker, what does it mean when recovery is an option that is consciously not taken? But while these questions are interesting, I will not be answering them tonight. You'll have to buy the book in 2 years when that's all done. This is just to tease you all tonight. So I wish to begin my talk tonight and work my way towards my thesis by drawing your attention to a medical incident from last month that I read about. In an article published on the 27th of September, readers of a BBC article titled "Canada Challenge to 6th Month Sobriety Rule for Liver Transplants" we're introduced to a 45-year-old Canadian man named Cary Gallant. Mr. Gallant needs a new liver, but because he's been an alcoholic for more than 20 years, Mr. Gallant's doctors have refused to consider him eligible for being placed on a liver transplant list until he has demonstrated 6 months of sobriety. Their decision is standard, but in Mr. Gallant's case, his circumstances are challenged by the fact that he is suffering from liver disease that was prompted by alcoholism. He has been sober for 3 months, but if he does not receive a new liver, he has a 75% chance of dying before that 6 months is up. Mr. Gallant's case is not unique, as the same governing body denied the same to another liver patient who died 2 weeks after being told he would die without a new liver, for which his alcoholism disqualified him. It made us all feel ashamed, his widow told the BBC. The bigger point being made in this article is how judgments about other people's behaviors and how their behaviors impact their health shape answers to this question: who deserves medical care? If we are challenged in this world by the burgeoning costs of medical care and in our conversations about who deserves it, we are also challenged by our current approaches to unhealthy persons and their bodies that oftentimes lead to marginalization in various forms that begin with our disgust of them and end in their death. An evolutionary response and culturally conditioned reaction, core disgust is rooted in a primal need to refrain from contaminating the mouth with things offensive to the taste or offensive to the social group. In time, humans have transformed and expanded core disgust to include judgments about people and their bodies. While disgust for and the subsequent marginalization of the ill and the dying is not uncommon in human history, that response poses significant challenges for Christianity, a religion founded on the actions of an individual whose responses to socially repugnant bodies was one of compassion and inclusion. Despite distinctions between centuries of suffering from late antiquity till now, not the least of which are geography, conservative Christian entitlement, overt homophobia, and barely latent xenophobia, responses to the second historic outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, and more recently Cary Gallant's need for a liver, invites us into the academic study of the marginalized ill for the following reason. In times of medical crisis, the answer to the question, who deserves medical care, is often shaped by a socio-moral view of the ill. The answer to that question is relevant not only for the study of religion, but also for natural sciences, philosophy, and ethics, because ease and increase of movement, climate change, and increasing resistance to medications are linked in some manner to disease, its rapid spread, and our response to it. In late antiquity, healthcare was, as my students have recently learned, both regional and transnational, if not exactly global. The movement of patients in the medical marketplace of antiquity was common, and patients traveled to appropriate caregivers and sites depending on the specifics of their healthcare needs. Appropriate services were often identified and marked out in specific churches devoted to the care for particular parts of the body, and we know that as we privilege and value certain parts of the body, so too in late antiquity there were parts of the body that had greater status than others. Were this not true, Paul's argument to the Corinthians about the importance of all body parts would not have been necessary. So, using a set of 7th century medical miracles as my foundational text, my presentation tonight will consider how provocative healing methods of two marginal, late antique, early medieval saints might be used in contemporary debates about how particular Christian theologies inform an individual's response to illness or bodily need. I argue that analysis of select passages from the miracles of Artemios suggest that although types of medical treatments described offer insight into the author's views of the historical figures, nevertheless, the authors employ the language of miraculous medical procedures primarily as a way of demonstrating that correct theology is of secondary importance to the needs of bodies in pain. I'm going to pause here and say to my students in the room, you have a little bit of insight into the thesis assignment that I'll be collecting in about 3 weeks. When I ask you to write a thesis, feel free to model. Though it is unfortunate that historic and contemporary responses to disease often conclude in socio-moral commentary on the afflicted, there exist more humane responses in the history of Christian responses to suffering, including theological arguments that the possibility of the redemption of dishonorable flesh is the very basis for human salvation. So, the shrine and its saints. Located in the Church of St. John the Forerunner in Constantinople, located roughly about here in a district close to the water, although in fairness it's all close to the water, the shrine of St. Artemios was a site of incubation where male and female patients would remain for periods of time ranging from a single night to several years in hopes for cures or relief related to the particular medical specialties provided by either St. Artemios or St. Febronia. And these are genital or intestinal diseases or hernias of the groin and testicular area. And I pause again to give you fair warning that that is what we are going to be talking about tonight. Now, Febronia's shrine is right here, and Artemios' shrine was underneath the altar. So there were staircases here and staircases here. Though the saints might provide surgery through opportunities provided by incubation where the patient was asleep and had a vision of the surgery, patients did not necessarily appeal to the saints or come to the shrine for hernia or testicular surgery, but more often to avoid it. They were looking for a different kind of relief or cure. Activities at the shrine related specifically to healing were centered around typical ritual behaviors, including commemorating the saints at vigil, lighting votive lamps before icons of the saints, applying oil from the tomb lamp on ailing body parts, or even drinking the oil from lamps. In addition to beseeching the holy healers through these traditional methods of pious practices, the afflicted might attempt self-healing or self-care by making use of a blend of oil and wax from lamps before the icons, which, when applied directly on the afflicted body part, or sometimes eaten, would act as a healing plaster. According to historians and chroniclers, the primary saint with the spiritual and medical authority around which this cult functioned was a 4th century duke of Dux Egypti, an Arian Christian named Artemios. A collective biography cobbled together from sources confirms that Artemios was by all accounts zealously Christian in all the worst ways. Neither theologian, ascetic, historian, or doctor, his fidelity to Arian Christianity was so zealous that this military leader was not above a bit of roughhousing. He was notable for having employed imperial troops to harass bishops, monks, and a nun while he was in pursuit of the famous Athanasius of Alexandria, the champion of Nicene Christianity. But as we know, Arian Christianity did not prevail as the main theological formula of emerging Christian theology, while Nicene Christology did. So, just a little aside, because you'll hear these terms and what these terms mean kind of matter. Just very quickly, I want to highlight that Nicene Christianity and Arian Christianity don't necessarily represent two branches, but reflect the creative dialogue about the person of Jesus. Nicene Christianity makes the claim that Jesus is co-eternal with God, while Arian Christianity, and these are horrifically simplified versions of these claims. I tremble before my religious colleagues, and just feel free to just jump right up. The Arian claim is that Jesus is not co-eternal with God. The Nicene claim is that Jesus and God are one nature, while the Arian claim is that Jesus is separate in nature from God. My favorite church historian, Justo Gonzalez, explains it using a beautiful little simple chart that I like so much. He argues that it can be understood this way, that Jesus and God are co-eternal and that there is a separation between Jesus and God from creation, whereas Arian Christianity understands Jesus as the first of God's created beings and so is apart from God, but closer to the created order. Okay, so it was not a foregone conclusion that Nicene Christology would triumph, if you will, although I don't like to use the military language for that. When Emperor Julian sought to restore the ancient values of Rome and advocated reform on multiple levels, including religious reform, Artemios was caught, our Arian Christian, was caught in the crosshairs of this policy. As a result of his past actions and association with Christianity, he was indicted by the city of Alexandria and beheaded for having despoiled the temple of Serapis and for having fought against citizens who came to the defense of his seizure and destruction of temple possessions. Now, this is not a very interesting death. This is an image from a manuscript. It's hardly worth mentioning. Centuries later, a pious fiction rehabilitated Artemios for Nicene Christianity by placing him in public opposition to Julian's ill treatment of Christians. In this account, Artemios was tortured and left to starve in prison. There he was visited by Christ and encouraged to play the man. After mocking Julian's failed attempt to reestablish cult activity at the Temple of Apollo, Artemios was crushed between two massive stones until, quote, his eyes popped out of their natural sockets and his genitals were unstrung, after which he was beheaded. Referring specifically to this brutal castration, for this reason, the anonymous author writes, though, quote, not a doctor nor the son of the doctors, the knowledge or ability required to be a world healer, which he did not have while with body, he grew wealthy in after departing from the flesh. A healing cult was established, and eventually his relics were sent to Constantinople and placed in a crypt in the Basilica of John the Baptist. Located in the Waxia district, close to the waters of the Golden Horn, the district was a hub of private houses, churches, shops, monasteries, and a hospice. In time, many sought cures at the shrine of St. Artemios for deeply alarming and vividly described diseases. An equally torturous past was shared by Artemios' medical colleague, Febronia, a 4th century martyred Christian woman from Nisibis who features in 3 of Artemios' miracles, and rather mysteriously in a 4th. Like Artemios, Febronia's spiritual and medical credibility is embedded in a brutal, ahistorical, epic passion narrative. Unique for several reasons, including a likely female authorship, a strong theme of friendship, and a striking poignancy in the tale, Febronia's Syrian cult was centered on the relics of a consecrated virgin whose arresting appearance and notable learned qualities so enraged an imperial representative that when she refused marriage, he subsequently punished her for this affront by, among other tortures, slicing off her breasts. The following century, the healing cult of Saint Febronia was socialized within the cult of Saint Artemios in Constantinople. Whereas a medical saint who suffered mutilation of body parts associated with gender, sexuality, or sexual behavior, she assisted female patients and mothers of male babies seeking comfort and cure at the shrine. In each case, the saints exercised dual spiritual and medical authority within their respective accounts, to which we now turn. Artemios, looking very much like Jesus. Artemios' tales are at times difficult to read, as 41 out of 45 miracle tales describe in acute detail men suffering from hernias in the groin or genital tumors. Most ailments are described in unapologetically graphic language, as are the treatments. A site of incubation, the patients would remain overnight at the shrine, and cures, when and if they come, are predictable in the accounts. The saint will appear often in disguise, inquire what is wrong, and order the patient to expose himself. While contemporary medical analysis laments the loss of touch in clinical practice, Artemios heals with a heavy hand, squeezing, stamping on, or incising genitalia, draining abscesses, binding the body tightly, or punching men in the groin. Worth noting, patients suffer many levels of discomfort, perhaps like some of you right now. The ailment, public and private shame for the ailment, and concurrent hope for and fear of the cure, as well as anxiety about if a cure is even to come. Layers of shame, fear of treatment, and bare human emotion are beautifully evident in George the Rhodian's encounter in the latrines, which I have given you all on the handout. Just very quickly, for many years, George was a hernia patient who suffered, and after many round trips back and forth to Constantinople, his sons asked, "Are you sailing back or are you going to stay here?" And he said, "My children, my sins are impeding me. I'm unworthy of receiving good health because of my deeds. I've given the saints a headache. I've defiled this church. I've annoyed the clergy. Bring me what you need to hold a banquet of fellowship with all of them and to sail out with you." A meal is then arranged, and in the middle of lunch, it happened that, feeling stomach pains, George went to the latrines, where he found a sad-faced man who asked, "Why are you distraught?" George replied, "For 2 years I've waited, and because of my sins I'm departing in disgrace." The other replied, "Let me see your testicles, whether they are larger than mine or smaller. Do not feel ashamed." George, with his own hand gripping that of his companion, guided it toward his testicles, but the other man firmly planted his hand on them, so the ship owner in pain cried out in a loud voice and said, "O man, what you have done, you have struck me with your nails and killed me. I am overwhelmed." Saying this, he saw himself healed, realizing the mystery of the miracle, that Artemios was one who accomplished this. Running from the place, he kept shouting, "Glory to you, God of Saint Artemios." Particular strategies are employed by authors and editors of the Artemios corpus, revealing a collective biography of a curious saint, his relationships with his patients, some remarkable therapeutic methods and qualities of patient vulnerability that transcend centuries, evident in the details of George's tale that sound particularly modern. He feels unworthy of a cure. He's a burden to his sons, doctors, and clergy, and he feels that his presence has defiled the space, all of which creates within him an obligation to repay those whose job it is to help in the very space designed for healing. A space not designed for healing is a latrine, and Artemios will cure George both in locations layered with significance and in a method designed to elicit a variety of responses. Revulsion, of course, but also humor and perhaps caution. It is neither out of the ordinary for a saint's life to include healings that seem designed to prompt disgust, that involve genitalia, vomiting, hemorrhaging, infertility, oozing, and worm-infested infections or diarrhea, nor is it out of the ordinary for saints to purify bodies using substances that suggest the same, urine, feces, or maggots, for example. A trope of intestinal incompetence, genital defect, or disease was long employed as evidence of a heretical nature, God's punishment for unorthodox beliefs. That an account would be devoted almost entirely to medical conditions that incite disgust and highlight discomfort, however, mark this document as quite unique. Time and again, Artemios brushes aside patients' physical and social fears about their bodies, inviting the reader into what Patricia Cox Miller defines as visceral seeing, a sensory realism that provides grounds for the negotiation of theology. Application of a theoretical model known as the New Intellectual Historical Model asks us to consider agenda apart from the author's intent, to uncover embedded relationships between right belief and power. The most casual read of the miracles exposes a body of work about powerless bodies, and I offer that this category of powerless bodies includes our saint's body as well. In her study of the miracles, Anne always astutely contends that the miracles provide venue and voice for ordinary men in pain, men degraded by feminized qualities of watery and gorged flesh, distended body parts, fetid smells, weakness, tears, and screams. always identifies that the humiliation of Homo Byzantinus is well defined, and that the men in the miracles are, quote, not behaving as they should, end quote. I argue that this category of men in pain should include our saint. For Artemios patients, their maleness is implicated in emotions displayed due to pain they fail to endure, crying, wailing, lamenting, actions which are derided as womanish in their society. The failure to endure illness or pain correctly without displaying suffering was shameful. Thus, the bodies of these male patients represent the effeminate and the powerless. As for Artemios, having not behaved as he should, having not displayed correct theological views in his lifetime, his maleness is implicated not only in a martyr account that strips him of his maleness, but in continued physical engagement with the diseased bodies of men who are categorized in their day as displaying womanish behavior. Measured in part by mastery of emotions and production of children, Byzantine masculine identity required that one had functioning genitalia. Removal of or damage to genitals compromised masculinity. Such men, eunuchs included, were non-generative, isolated from the fabric of their social groups, degraded to the degree that they remained with them. The quality of being male, distinct from being a man, in such a context was modeled from the top down by an imperial figure who represented homocentric values that distinguished sexual categories such as physical and emotional endurance, control of desire, and resolve in the face of pain and death. In the miracles, male patients display few, if any, of these qualities. The question of a male paradigm becomes vastly more complicated for men who struggled with disorders of the lower stratum, and who, as a result, labored to keep pain under control. In his study on the grotesque, Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin's theory of the distorted offers that this lower stratum is the site of one's mortification. An object is degraded according to the grotesque method. They send it down to the absolute bodily lower stratum, to the zone of the genital organs, the bodily grave, in order to be destroyed, end quote. But it is important to note that destruction does not mean annihilation for Bakhtin, for Christian theology, or hagiography. In all cases, a grotesque object is always transformed, and with that, it is regenerated and redeemed. As Artemios patients suffer pain, despondency, and feminine displays of emotion for their sins and their failures, and in a location, I would add, of social and economic exchange, I offer that the administrator of the cure is simultaneously implicated and regenerated with them. Does physical engagement with humiliated bodies offer the opportunity for recovery for the patient and redemption for Artemios from an Aryan past? Predictably, authors of the miracles take pains to identify as Artemios as an intercessor of healing, not the cause. He marks and heals diseased genitals as a servant of the Trinity, validating shrine activity and locating it firmly within Nicene territory. As other medical saints, Artemios heals with proper theology, assuring a patient that, quote, the Holy Trinity, which created all things visible and invisible, which preserves all and watches over the diseased and sick, will cure you itself. In stark contrast to medical language that is explicit to the point of discomfort or even comedy, polemical language such as this, John Haldon suggests, is evidence of a continued progression of the composition of the text. Evidence, I argue, of a continued theological rehabilitation of an Arian martyr. The historical record of Artemios does not present us with a future saint, but with a challenge. Irrespective of alleged high or low Christology, he died presumably for defending Christians, which, for Theodoret and his ecclesiastical history, is sufficient. For others, it is not. Athanasius of Alexandria, once sought by Artemios, had this to say about the alleged heretic Arius, from whom we get the name Arian theology. We, being concorporeal therewith, are saved by the same. And before I go past this icon, it's a contemporary Coptic icon. And do you notice anything interesting here in the image? Standing on Arius. He's standing on Arius. It's precious. Is Artemios saved by the same? And by the same, I reference not a divine incarnation, but by Artemios' incarnate sharing of a human experience of agonizing and humiliating pain in the clinic, by his physical contact with diseased and damaged body parts, and by his willingness to engage with emotions that betray torment, bodily weakness, and frailty. Healing in hagiography is often concerned with transformation of the impure into the pure, and more than 90% of Artemios' patients have him physically, intimately engaged with that about which no one wanted to speak. So, let's talk about recovery. As mentioned above, 43 of the 45 miracle tales in the Artemios collection are concerned entirely with male patients, consisting of grown men, male infants, or small boys. Only 2 miracle tales include female patients, and in both cases they are young women. One is identified as a 12-year-old, but the age of the other young woman is unidentified. She is old enough to be betrothed, which might make her anywhere between 7 and 13. When cures came to adult male patients in the Artemios accounts, they were predictable in structure, but consistently unpredictable with respect to the cruelty involved in the cure. When Artemios extends his medical and spiritual authority to others to act on his behalf, it is never pleasant, even though it will ultimately benefit the patient. There are considerable distinctions when holding male cures up in comparison to the female patients. When hernia surgery for female patients, while hernia surgery for female patients did not carry with it the possibility of castration as it did for male patients, nevertheless, the probability of complications and almost certainty of patient trauma were faced equally by all, irrespective of gender. But while tales of adult male patients are visceral in descriptions of diseased or damaged anatomy and treatment, the remedy of the young woman's illnesses in the miracles are considerably more gentle and respectful of proprietary boundaries. The account or case study from the miracles on which I shall focus specifically to address the theme of recovery is Miracle 24, the Betrothed Woman. You have an excerpt from that on your handout. This tale is comprised of 5 sections, only the first of which actually addresses our betrothed woman. The patient is a young woman who develops what is identified in the text as an inguinal hernia after her engagement. Being accompanied by her mother and expecting a cure, she spends 15 days in incubation at the shrine of Artemios, but she receives no assistance. Distressed, the mother and daughter return home. That night, the young woman's mother receives a vision in her sleep in which Artemios informs the mother to take her daughter back to the church, but, quote, "Go to Sister Febronia and she will treat her," end quote. They return, but they divert from the main altar built above the relics of St. Artemios to a small chapel on the right. Presumably they remain there, and sometime during the night, in the oratory of the Holy Martress Febronia, the mother of this young woman sees, quote, "a most attractive woman dressed in monastic garb. She sees her make a plaster from a wax salve and apply it to her daughter. The attractive woman, now identified in the text as Febronia, directs the mother to, quote, "Go give praise to God and to the Holy Forerunner and to Holy Artemios." The mother awakes and finds her daughter with a plaster set in place, healthy just as from birth. As a medical miracle, this is fairly standard, and the pieces are assembled in requisite fashion. You have an ill person, you have supplication, you have task accomplished, cure completed, God praised. But as an Artemios miracle, it is tame and rather uneventful. Aside from the uniqueness of an account concerning a female hernia patient, we have in this miracle uncharacteristic sensitivity and concern for privacy and modesty. This is significant because in addition to shared medical authority, our author does not suggest that Artemios is the healer of men's testicular pain, damage, or disease, because Artemios is a superior healer, or specifically male healer, but because Artemios himself suffered testicular pain and damage over the course of martyrdom, Pain and damage which Febronia, with a distinct set of genitals altogether, would not have suffered. The distinct martyr events of Artemios and Febronia distinguish them for service for those who suffer in similar fashion to how they suffered. While many of the Artemios miracles conclude with a healed patient, the first portion of the miracle avoids concluding through diversion into what is effectively a sermon, not about Febronia, but about Artemios. Instead of focusing on Febronia, the author redirects the reader in the second section back to Artemios' passion narrative, propounding that which grants the privilege for medical cures, benefit of instruments, and developing an argument for the value of first-hand knowledge and proficiency. Neither education nor background are the primary requirements necessary to assist a patient, our author claims, but those with direct experience of shared pain and suffering of the patients are more capable of offering care to those who suffer than those with professional training or ancestral advantage. Distinct from the majority of the Artemios miracles in subject as well as structure, in the third section, our author offers a scathing critique of contemporary hernia practices as procedures as endured by female patients at the hands of Byzantine surgeons. After reminding the reader of Artemios' credentials, how he exchanged a mortal career as a military commander for that of an immortal healer, the author tips his hand, and I would direct you to that second paragraph, where the author writes, "So where are the fine-sounding Hippocrates and Galen and the countless other quacks? Those who follow these authorities maintain that since this kind of female complaint is only an inguinal hernia, people ought most definitely to make an incision on the full skin of the female patient wherever the membrane bulges under the strain of the swelling. Artemios followed none of these practices, but on the contrary, those who vomit forth such bilge have come to naught through the intervention of the martyr, so that not only do holy men outshine them, but others, holy women as well." This denunciation of invasive inguinal hernia surgery for women offers us insight into 7th century Byzantine medical procedures and concerns which both patients and medical professionals shared about these practices. Though 1st and 2nd century physicians recommended a conservative approach for the treatment of inguinal hernias, favoring poultices and bandaging, Byzantine physicians seem to prefer and almost certainly practiced surgical solutions. A 4th century description of the challenges of groin surgery includes the possibility of testicular damage or loss, a known concern expressed by male patients in the Artemios miracles, including George the coppersmith, who, when advised to have a doctor amputate his diseased testicles, cried, "Oh my, you are urging me to my death." And I just want to say there was a lot more art I could have included here, but I don't know, I had a little mercy. Despite grim and painful possibilities, Byzantine surgeons, informed by Galenic-inspired medical documentation of famous Alexandrine physicians Aetios of Amedia, operated so frequently on inguinal hernias that a single category of lower surgeons specialized in this procedure, and specific instruments existed for surgical procedures which were categorized as, quote, general. The frequency of procedures conducted by practitioners considered of lesser status than their peers might possibly have contributed to fears not just about castration on the part of the male patient or the marriageability and fertility of female patients, but might also reflect a desire for accountability on behalf of the patient by the patient's family and the need for more frequent attention to well-known and established naturopathic approaches to those suffering from diseases of the lower stratum. Our author's critique highlights the necessary intervention of spiritual authorities when procedures carelessly done by medical professionals proved life-threatening or fatal. In such circumstances, our author claims, even an ascetic woman is superior in her medical authority than the trained professional or the man with ancestral status, providing greater chance for recovery. After the author's diversion, he returns to the healing account, perhaps having remembered that the narrative requires an ending. Febronia, he muses in the 4th section, surely operates as Artemios' partner in spiritual and medical authority because of the patient's sense of modesty, a concern present nowhere else in the accounts of Artemios' male patients. A definition and understanding of modesty in late antiquity was varied. Modesty as a specifically feminine concept could, of course, refer to a person's sexual purity, but also to their demure behavior, quietness, moral character, and shyness. Conversely, due to modesty, however it's defined, female patients were attended to by our aforementioned Febronia, quote, because there are times, our author writes, when Christ's martyr relies upon Febronia to assist in the miracle making when women are in question, end quote. For a young woman of an age as the subject of this miracle, an inguinal hernia was a rare but distressing condition, and one which could present problems such as defects in genital tracts, the descent of an ovary into a hernia sac, intersexuality, and infertility. While we are privileged by profound advances in biology and natural sciences to understand these medical conditions with some sophistication in the 21st century, they were also understood to some degree, and they were of no less concern for people in the 7th. As Febronia's staunch rejection of marriage resulted in the torture and destruction of body parts needed for what would be considered a successful marriage, she is the appropriate figure to tend to the medical care and recovery of a young woman whose primary tasks were to be betrothed, to be married, and to bear children. The single most significant physiological episode in a Constantinopolitan woman's life, childbearing was risky, infertility was worse. The considerable bulge that signified the presence of an inguinal hernia in a young woman's body could, were she attended to by the invasive procedures of the day, quickly shift her from diseased to dying, or distressed to dying. Recovery was not always an option. Notably, in our account, the mother finds her daughter, quote, healthy just as from birth. And there is no ambiguity about how this comes to be the case. Febronia is praised for having reversed this distressing set of circumstances and for having, quote, cured this medical problem by the use of a wax salve made for such a treatment by those practiced in hernia operations. In the author's final promotion of holistic, non-surgical procedures. In closing his narrative with his final section, the author returns us to Artemios' lower stratum. The ability to cure, he writes, is brought to fruition precisely and specifically through a transaction. The saint suffered in horrible ways, and here the author regales the reader once again with the details. But God rewards in particular and distinguishing ways that conclude with a young woman's recovery. So in addition to the author's argument in favor of a conservative approach to treatment, which suggests unease with the swiftness by which surgeries happened, and a decline in confidence for surgeries to be done well. And in addition to the author's argument for topical pharmaceuticals and human touch as preferential to the surgeon's cut, the author locates religious and medical authority within a figure who is an empathetic representative of pain and suffering, which the patient also endures, which links to the important Christological claim of the Incarnation. So, to conclude, the taming of history through greater representation of exemplary individuals who have been associated with what is considered flawed theology opens up the possibility for far more humane approaches to and treatment of those in pain and those who seek to aid the suffering. This matters for contemporary theological analysis of exemplary behavior and its models, because the concept of the moral exemplar developed within Christian theology into violent atonement soteriologies, a view that contradicts a visceral response of compassion modeled in the Gospels and lives of holy persons, a view that diminishes the significant actions of compassion of Jesus' social actions, and a view absent in far too many contemporary Christian responses to the ill and the marginalized. In the latter half of the 7th century, many questions were entertained about Orthodox belief and its relationship to behavior. And the rapidly fluctuating political and religious map of the 7th century provided hagiographers with occasions for asking how God operates in the world and through whom. Though these tales are disquieting, visceral seeing cannot distract from civic and theological underpinnings in the text, which modern attitudes tempt us to understand as existing apart from each other. Though the ill are routinely treated in provocative ways, the greater point of the miracles is that our healing saints are not allowed to be indifferent to, fearful of, or disgusted by those in physical and emotional distress. They are to respond because they too suffered. Illness is an opportunity in these tales for one group of Christians, and care for the ill is the obligation of the other. But illness as an opportunity to cleanse the world of bodies that differ from some imagined norm violates the central theological claim of the Incarnation and misrepresents Christianity's historic response to those in pain, as demonstrated by the authors of the miracles of St. Artemios. Though revolting, irreverent, and humorous, this curious collection reminds us that we all have a share in the type of humanity displayed in the text, and that there will be moments when boundaries between the pure and the impure humanity must be blurred willingly if we wish to think of ourselves as humane. Diolch. Thank you.
I'm sure there are lots of questions. Yes.
I can't wait.
Of course, I'm very much interested in the kind of continuity and rupture between, well, traditional Roman practices. I think you talk about incubation, you think of an Asclepion, so there might be some ideas. So do we have a link there? On the other hand, it seems to be a deliberate rupture as well. So you want to do something completely different, you disregard earlier medical texts, but then your saint Peponia, of course, does remind you of like February, kind of, you know, February is a month of purification, the god of purification, and she's also responsible for purification. So there seems to be a more problematic relationship between traditional Roman values and the new Christian values. Thank you for explaining. Fiona.
Yes. So I'm curious because it might be a conversation to think about. Talking about the way there should be some sort of sympathy towards people with kind of difficult reactions with natural anthropology. One of the arguments saying talks about those who fall such fire or build. Is that talking about like the quacks that gave them the properties?
Yeah.
So is there much use of the idea of kind of repulsive bodily sort of functions and the idea of treating arguments and that kind of thing?
I think that's a really clear way of saying that ideas that people relate that are wrong or repugnant can be attributed to bodily functions, right? So I think that is, I would agree with you, right, that they're using that same kind of language for medical practitioners, right, as well as the bodies of the patient, if I'm understanding you correctly. It is traditional that, especially in religious texts, people die in the latrines, right? So that they, I mean, the word in worst case, Arius is the perfect example. If you look at the accounts of Arius as he, as the story progresses through the centuries, his death gets more and more violent until finally his bowels burst forth in the latrine just before he's about to be brought back into the community. Right? So I mean, they got to kill him in the toilet before they can, you know, redeem him. So I think that if I'm you know, following from what you're saying, this author is saying that repugnant ways of speaking about things or wrong ways of doing things can be considered like vomit.
Yeah, no, just the notion that you sort of very broadly sort of descriptions of speech in this text around bodily.
Well, everything in that text is just nothing but it's just liquid. Right? It's just, I remember reading Angela's Ashes and just thinking, this is just about nothing but tears, rain, and vomit. And it's kind of the same thing. Right? It's just a little bit hard. You have to take it just like Lord of the Rings, one chapter.
Thanks, Jenny.
So he was alien. Yeah. But your argument, I mean, it's fascinating, really interesting. But to what extent were the later people aware that he was alien if he had been redeemed? So to what extent was the humiliation and punishment visited on him in the text, and then putting him into a situation where he could be redeemed through healing, by healing another? How was that related to the alien? Were they still aware of him being alien? Or was this something that was embedded below the surface?
The stories about Artemios take about 3 centuries to evolve, and like the story of Arius, you kind of go through a progression. So you have one death, and it's just, it's just a death. And because he was a martyr, him being Aryan, it almost doesn't matter. At least that's what one historian has said. I'm not sure I agree with him. I think
your argument is
that I think it does matter, and I believe that because it was known where he was from, and his history wasn't unknown to the authors. So I think it was part of the narrative. I think it was intended to be a humiliation of him. But you can't humiliate him because you've got a shrine where stuff is actually happening. But I don't know. But why all of this constant, going down into the depths? Yeah. Did I see a hand?
You mentioned at the end about Christology, and you gave a definition of the incarnation at the end. How Christ-like was this saint? Because a lot of what you've discussed talks about the humiliation of Jesus, who died on the cross, the most, vile way of dying.
Yeah.
So, are there any elements in these hagiographies of him being Christ-like in the way he's depicted?
Yeah, yes and no. Yes, in that there's a lot of description of his bodily humiliation in his martyr accounts. I think there's 4 martyr accounts total. But he doesn't display in any of them any of the types of behaviors that one would often find in a martyr account. Like when you think about early martyr accounts, like Polycarp, it's just modeled. It's modeled on the Gospels, right? It's modeled on a passion narrative, and you don't have that in the Artemios martyr account. You have the physical humiliation of the body without any of the kind of compassionate stuff that you find in the Gospels. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question thoroughly. In his martyr accounts, you don't have Christ-like activity. In the miracles themselves, you have mention of Artemios being Christ-like and dying, in a proper way for Christ. But nothing about him in his lifetime, because his actions in his lifetime were fairly repugnant. Even as a good Aryan Christian, he was a soldier. Went out harassing nuns and whatnot. Yeah. Did I answer enough? Yes. Because I can keep
Any more questions? Yes, Lance. Yes, please.
Implicit in the attack on the early possibility of medical rights, like Galen, for example. Presumably, this is an inference which I imagine is tested in other evidence. Galen, in particular, is actually quite popular as a medical writer, and his techniques obviously still hold quite a lot of sway, alongside obviously the religious tradition. So I don't know whether this can be used to fit into a wider argument about the popularity of Galen still in the late antique period.
I think it could be, and it's in some ways it's an unfortunate example to introduce you to the text, because they're in a lot of these medical miracles, as many of my students will be reading, there is appreciation for and use of physicians. At the same time, there's appreciation for and use of individuals considered holy healers. So many people coming to the Artemios shrine were there because they'd already seen a medical doctor, and maybe what they had was just too people didn't want to, no, you're going to die from that, so I'm not going to take one with my patient. Or maybe people just couldn't treat it. Or a lot of the times in the text, people were embarrassed, right? In the description of the diseased parts of the body, it's deeply troubling to read how people suffer. And so for, again, over 90% of the patients we're dealing with are men, and they're not interested in, showing these horrible diseases, even probably to another male doctor. So I think that the mention of those medical doctors is a way of saying that there is a professional medical history here that is still part of the conversation. It doesn't always work, and sometimes what they do is they just vomit forth bile, right? And they don't have it all. And so I think probably also there's got to be some kind of pride and some kind of we have to remember that miracle accounts, whether they're healing miracles or connected to the shrine or space, they're a form of propaganda, right? They want people to hear these stories. They want people to come. And so it's a way of advertising, a way of saying, hey, in the medical marketplace of late antiquity, right, we've got this too. We've got this side too.
Denigrate your natural science.
Yeah, exactly.
Fiona.
Sorry, I have a slight follow-up on that, which is quite a ignorant question. But would it be cheaper to go to a saint or to a medical doctor to go to any individual cost?
Yes, it would have been cheaper, and what's very clear to us, Holly was all good stuff. What's very clear is that people are paying there as well, but in a lot of them they're not necessarily expected to. Now, it's believed that the Artemio shrine was right next to a hospital, so presumably, there was interaction in between. A lot of the healing shrines within cathedrals or basilica were supported by members of the community, bishops. They were sort of written in, so funding was provided for them. So it wasn't the case that people had to come and necessarily pay a fee for anybody who treated them in a church. So yes, it would be cheaper. A lot of the time in Saints' Tales, we have some very clear evidence that people have spent all their money before they've even gotten there. So it's not the case that people are just going to individuals considered holy healers or saints or sacred sites and saying, oh, I've got a new toenail and it hurts. Can somebody fix this? A lot of times people have exhausted their resources or are embarrassed or, they're kind of at the end of their rope. And so they have nothing left. They have nothing left to pay for health care. So, murder doesn't cost anything. Also with the Artemio shrine, they would take care of people who were there. So while you were there, you would have a place to sleep, you would have food. They would provide bedding for you, clean your clothes, right? So not only were you not paying, but your treatment your comfort was taken care of. Probably the most famous individual involved in this kind of healthcare was known as John the Almsgiver, the Bishop of Alexandria. Just a couple decades, just a century before Artemio, so a little bit before these miracles were written. And what's fascinating to me about St. John the Almsgiver is he builds several hospitals, and he builds some separate hospitals for women. And he builds at least 3 hospitals just for women giving birth. And they have something like 42 beds, and every day they're giving clean clothes, clean bedding, and money is set aside in a little lockbox for them. So when they leave, they can take these alms with them, in addition to clean clothes and bedding. So there's some of the churches that had not official hospitals but had healing shrines in them were pretty sophisticated systems of healthcare. Whether there was a saint there or not.
I find this absolutely fascinating because obviously an incision into an ulcer or an abscess would create a kind of vomiting liquid, poisonous stuff. So it's almost like saying that they are occasionally, they become part of the poison which is infecting the person in the first place.
Interesting.
Now, especially interesting on what we've just been talking about the alignment of the religious and the medical in other areas. What's the provenance of this particular, how significant was this as a movement in its particularity, its connection with these particular bodily dysfunctions, and its relation also, as you suggest, which I think sounds very convincing, that it also has the religious context in the sense of the areas being themselves sort of infected.
I think I can answer your question best by telling you a little bit more of the history, and I won't talk too long because I don't know how. Just
We've got about 20 minutes before.
The healing shrine doesn't start in Constantinople for this particular set of maladies. It actually begins in an area of Anatolia, okay, which is close to where you have a large pocket of Nicene Christians, Arian Christians. And so what's interesting is that the healing shrine that is affiliated with this particular medical malady doesn't begin in Constantinople, but it's transferred in time to Constantinople. So what that means is whatever medical personnel are there helping people with these problems go with it to Constantinople. Now what's interesting to me about that, and this is research that is like outlined but not done, okay, so I can just kind of tell you a little bit about that. What's interesting to me about that is I think this is part of a bigger issue, and this is why I think Artemios is being used in this way by the authors, is that Constantinople becomes the new Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem, once it is no longer if you will, in the hands of Christians, right? Persians, and then Christians, but then Arabs, right? Jerusalem ceases to matter as much for Constantinople. It matters more, really, for Rome, because Rome isn't right there dealing with the changing landscape. And so Constantinople really becomes the reliquary par excellence of Christianity, okay? And it becomes the city of the world's desire in terms of orthodoxy. And so I think that the movement of a shrine that is popular and is dedicated to a particular healing, I think that is seen as an important one to incorporate into the city. Now I don't know that I've got this right, but this is part of what I'm working with in the making of Constantinople as a theologically correct city for the sake of preservation against rising forces in the world, that they're concerned about happening in the south.
And the increasingly violent martyrdoms, versions of the martyrdom, take place after the move to Constantinople.
Yes.
Just talking about the spread of the cult, so you mentioned propaganda, so always kind of creating propaganda. So how important was this cult outside Constantinople? Did we find it in Western Europe or in Scotland? Or?
No, he's important only in one other place, and that's in Egypt, because he was a soldier affiliated with Alexandria. And so when you see Artemios icons, and I put one on the handout for you. He's always in military garb, and he ends up being part of a select few military martyrs, and military martyrs will rise in importance after a period So just from about this point forward, military martyrs are going to be important for the city, in part because of what, what Constantinople sort of gathering in on itself and sort of preparing for the changing imperial boundaries. And it will be involved in multiple wars with the Bulgarians, with various tribes that move across from the Black Sea area over, from Arabs and from the Seljuk Turks. And so the notion of the military Christian, I think very similar to what you see in the 19th century with muscular Christianity, becomes quite prominent. And so Artemios sort of becomes divorced from his importance as a healing saint and just as a military saint. He becomes incorporated along with George, Theodore, and Demetrios of Thessaloniki. So you'll see him mostly among in that company.
Yes, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Yes, please.
About George in the toilet area. I'm interested in the fact that it seems like it's his faith. He gives up, but then he gives a fellowship dinner for those who healed him. Was that helpful? Do you think in Artemios' tales, how often does the faithfulness of the patient actually help? In other words, do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, I do see what you're asking.
Because a lot of them seem to give up and go away, and then they're healed on the way. And is that?
No, not a lot of them. That
Okay.
just as George, right? There's a couple examples. Mostly, I would say, if I wanted to talk percentages, which I'm really bad at, which is why I'm in the humanities. I'd say about 75% of the people are healed in a vision, in a dream, lying, writhing in agony. What I think, though, it's not faith, it's despair. I think that you're right in saying that it comes to a point, right? I can think of another case of a woman who goes to the shrine of Martin of Tours, and she goes for healing and nothing happens, and she's healed on the way home, right? So there you have kind of a similar thing, but I wouldn't argue that it's faith, that heals him. The author would say it's God, and George's faith has got nothing to do with it. In fact, George is not faith. But George believes that there's, and to me, what's important in that text, just as a person, not as a historian, but how much shame he feels and how embarrassed he is by what his body is doing. And I just found, all of the tales are compelling and poignant. But that one just really stuck out to me because you think about people who are sick and they feel they're a burden, and they feel like I have to do something, I have to throw a party, I have to thank you. If someone's taking care of you, they're doing their job. Right, DJ? That's right. Yeah.
He's not used to this place. Yes. Not just one side. So having been healed, by being healed by God, is this just a sign to say, now he goes and he gains confidence in God, he regains his faith? Is this the whole purpose of being healed in all possible situations? So it's not actually going to a place, it's believing in the way, but being healed. Then you actually go and gain your faith.
Yeah, and considering that it's done in a toilet.
Yes.
Right? And that's where Arius, by the time you get to the full Arian accounts, that's where Arius dies. So is this some way of recovering the toilet? Right? I have to write that down before I forget. Yeah, that's not subtle at all. Right? Yeah. See you next week.
Yeah. They do know that's not quite right.
Making a point.
Any more questions? Anybody? No? Okay, so in this case,
Thank
I
you.
can leave to let you off the hook. So thank you very much for this. Thank you all for coming. you have a glass of wine as well. Just to remind you that next week's our next classic seminar, Founders Library, 6 o'clock. It's going to be, well, something more late antique again in St. Augustine. One of our new members of UWTC from CALS, from the Center of Advanced Graduate Catholic Studies. So please come next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
all.
you.
Wait, they're recorded, right? So
Yes, it's recorded.